Tuesday, January 21st, 2020, meeting of the Planning Commission. This meeting is hereby called to order. First order of business is pledge allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, looking for an approval of the agenda. That's for tonight's meeting, is it? They should be working, yes.
Did you let her know that we're ready?
Yep,
Okay.
I made a lot of noise with the gavels.
Okay.
Knew we were gonna begin.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the minutes for the agenda.
Which one?
This is the agenda. Okay, any nays? None? Carried. Okay, we're getting into the new business already.
Approval of,
Approval of minutes.
Oh, yeah, I skipped that one. Approval of minutes from the November 19th, 2019 meeting. Anybody, all
I'll make a motion to accept.
right?
I'll second.
A motion and a second to approve the minutes of the November 19th, 2019 meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Hearing
Abstain.
none, that's approved.
I'll abstain.
Yeah, you can abstain. All right, we're going to get into the new business. And before we get started, I'd like to let everybody know how this occurs. Number one, and most important, no comments. Does the microphone broadcast in here? No, that's strictly for the recording. This is a small room, so hopefully it'll work out. Anyway, no comments from the audience at all, period, until there's an open session for the public hearing, and then you can speak here. If we don't follow that, it's going to cause a lot of trouble for creating a record of the meeting. Our meetings are recorded on TV and sound and notes. But things that happen out there, somebody yells at me or whatever, it doesn't get picked up by these mics. So we request that no comments from the audience at all during the entire meeting. You can raise a hand and be called on, but that's usually only during public comments. So, the other thing, turn your cell phones off if you didn't do it already. When you do get the public meeting going, each person that comes up to the microphone to talk, there's a sheet there that needs to be signed, name and address type thing. And that is also very important because we have to have a record of it. Who spoke at the meeting, and if nobody signs the card, we have messed up records again. So please do that if you are going to have some comments tonight. Now, how we do this, first off, we'll have our city planner give us a brief information about this first order of business, which is the consideration and use permit for wildlife rehabilitation and veterinary activities. So that's going to be our first order of business, and she'll give us that talk on that stuff. We can ask her questions when she's done, and then applicant will be asked to come up and give a talk. And as that goes along, we will interact with the applicant. At some point thereafter, we will open the public hearing to hear your comments. And we cannot interact with you in public comments. We're here to listen and make little notes to ourselves and so on. So don't expect us to have a conversation. So I just wanted you to all be aware of that. That's how we're going to conduct the meeting. And so our first thing right now is the public hearing consideration and conditional use permit for wildlife rehabilitation and veterinary activities at 10629 Jamaica Avenue North. Can you give us a opening description of what's going on, Jennifer?
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. As you stated before you this evening, we have a request for a new conditional use permit on the subject property. The applicant and owner of the property is the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota. The representative that we have before us this evening is Phil Jenny. He is in the audience and is here to answer some questions. I also may rely on him since this is a little bit of a different application that we're reviewing tonight. I think this is probably the one and only, if you will, in this area and maybe even in the state. So from that perspective, I'll rely on him to help us out with understanding some of the activities on the site. As you mentioned, the property is located at 10629 Jamaica Avenue North. The property is zoned and guided A1. The parcel collectively, when you consider both PIDs, is approximately 22.01 acres. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. The requested CUP is to operate and develop a wildlife rehabilitation center from the subject property. We'll talk a little bit about the activities that they conduct at their current facility versus what they propose to conduct here, because they are different and they're not the same. So there was a pretty extensive narrative that was provided to you in your packets this evening. I did my best not to regurgitate or restate what's in that narrative. So for those in the audience that are interested, that narrative is very thorough and talks a lot about the activities at the current facility. So rather than talk about that, tonight is really about what the proposed activities are in Grant. This evening, there was a public hearing that was noticed. Obviously, we noticed 3 public hearings tonight, but this is the first of 3, all of them scheduled at 6:30. So this is our first consideration. As a reminder to the planning commissioners and those that are in the audience, when we look at our ordinance, we have specific criteria that we are to review a conditional use from. So section 32-152 is really the section that tells us when we're determining what conditional use permit activities should be permitted. We should look at what's happening on nearby lands and buildings and how the proposed use is consistent or compatible with, or whether or not there are certain conditions that should be placed on the proposed activities in order for them to be compatible with adjacent land uses. So from that perspective, that's what we're here to look at. There are also obviously multiple code sections that apply to the proposed application. Many of them are in the staff report. Some of them are in the presentation tonight, but essentially this is our overarching thing that we need to look at when we review conditional use permits. A little bit different. Usually I start with what the proposed activities are, but because we have such a complex application this evening, I decided to start with the existing site conditions because I think that it gives us a better framework from which to look at the operations. So the existing conditions, as I stated, were over 20 acres. That's important in the city of Grant from the perspective of if you have more than 20 acres, we do not limit the number of accessory buildings and the total square footage on parcels that are 20 acres or greater. So we do have that condition here if both parcels that are the subject of the application are included. There is an existing principal building, so there was a homestead that was on the property. Many of the commissioners may recall that we actually have an existing conditional use permit that is on the property for an existing cell tower. So we have seen this property, but not this owner before. So there's an existing home that's on the property. There are approximately 12 existing accessory buildings and or sheds. There are various uses in each of those accessory buildings, so I'm not going to go through every single one of them on the site plan, but basically we had some that were for storage, some that were sheds or what we sometimes don't even count or calculate, so less than 120 square feet of building. There were some that were for domestic farm animals, so we had pretty much every use that you could think of in terms of accessory buildings on the property. As I stated, there was an existing cell tower and enclosure on the property. That activity or that conditional use permit is actually proposed to remain and is not being proposed to remove as part of this. So this is an unusual situation from the respect of we don't see a lot of properties that have multiple conditional use permits on them, but we do have a couple. So the example that comes to mind right away is actually the school properties where There are actually 3, 4, 5 conditional use permits that all apply to a specific parcel. So it's not impossible, it's just unusual, and we don't have a lot of them. So with respect to tonight, that is proposed to remain in place. The existing access and driveway into the principal and accessory structure is proposed to remain. So there are no alterations or changes that are proposed as part of the application. There are existing wetlands and pretty extensive existing vegetation, particularly along the northern border of the property on the site as well. So an aerial, because I think this is a little bit easier to look at than the site plan, particularly when we're looking on the screen. So you can see that the parcel, or the parcels, I should say, are bordered by 107th Street on the north, and then Jamaica is on the west. The existing access is from the west, that's proposed to remain. When you look at the site plan, the majority of that vegetation is also proposed to remain on that northerly side. You can see from the aerial on the southern edge of the property that there is an existing pond/wetland area. That's important, particularly when we look at one of the uses that's proposed as part of this with the waterfowl facility that's on that southern edge. As part of the existing conditions, sometimes we will see a wetland delineation that's been performed. In this case, a wetland delineation has not been performed, so you'll see in my staff report this evening that we talk a little bit about that from the respect of we have setbacks and buffer requirements from wetland edges. In order to determine whether or not some of the proposed activities actually fall outside of it, we would actually need to do a boundary or an edge locate on that wetland to make sure that everything is set back outside of it. So moving on to a summary of the operations, this is where I'm going to stay very high level, and the applicant can tell you in more detail, because while I can read and understand the narrative, this is not my area of expertise. So Wildlife Rehabilitation Center is certainly a unique use, and it's not something that we see all over the place. The narrative does state that they do treat or have, I don't know if they're clients or if they're, I don't know what they are. So animals, we've got waterfowl, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and songbirds that are all treated as part of their current operations, which today are in Roseville. So the existing Wildlife Rehabilitation Center hospital is actually in Roseville. As part of this application, you can, I'm sure if you've read the narrative, notice that they're proposing to actually keep that in play. So the hospital location in Roseville will remain, and this will supplement. So the hospital will be where the emergency veterinary services remain. On this site is where there will be sort of that transition care, if you will, with some veterinary services, but the majority of it being rehabilitation services. They're proposing as part of this application to utilize the existing homestead for intern living quarters. They are, from what I can understand in the application, we can certainly verify with the applicant, proposing to utilize the majority of the existing accessory buildings on site in some way, whether or not they're adapted or reconfigured, but for the most part, they're proposing to use those as part of the operations. They are proposing some construction, but that construction to occur over the next 10 years. So because of their nonprofit status, et cetera, some of this has to do with a fundraising effort. So they're not going to go out there and build a facility tomorrow, but as fundraising and as funds become available, they would propose to put these structures in place. So the timing of it is not entirely known. So when we meaning staff, met with the applicant in a pre-application meeting, we said, tell us what your build out is, because that's really what we need to consider instead of having a piecemeal approach to this. So what would you like to see? What's your proposed full build out of the site, full operations, and then let's review that so that we really get a comprehensive perspective of what they're anticipating on the site. So that's what's before you this evening. And if you read the narrative, it's somewhere between the next 5 and 10 year build out, if you will, of when some of those structures might appear, if you will, or be proposed to be constructed. So those structures include the main nursery facility, some outdoor caging areas that are associated with that main nursery facility, and then the waterfowl facility, and then there's also the ponding and the cage facility or caging that's associated with that portion of the facility. So those are sort of the new construction main facilities. There are some caged areas that are exclusive or not attached to those structures. That's my understanding that those would be constructed in the fairly near future, because that's how they would perform their operations out there. The other piece there's there's 2 large fenced areas that are proposed, and that those would also be constructed immediately. So from a phasing perspective, that's my overall understanding. The applicant can certainly provide more clarification if that's not accurate. The operations, they are proposing to construct a parking lot on the property to support the employees and then the volunteers. Again, there's a little bit of a build-out situation here of initial activities will not be as much or as intense as they're ultimately planned to be. Therefore, there might not be a lot of site activity initially, but then it would evolve and maybe grow into more based on what's in the narrative. So we can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. From an hours of operation perspective, they're essentially proposing year-round activities, but the majority of their efforts and their work would be seasonal. So between mid-March through mid-October is when their highest volume of clients or users would be on site. So from that perspective, it would be fairly quiet in the winter based on the proposed operations, but there would be a more intense operation during those months. As I stated, the applicant is proposing to have interns live in the existing principal structure on site. In the narrative, they've identified up to 5 interns living in the property, so that's certainly something for discussion. They, in their narrative, propose the hours of 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., essentially during their hot season or the summer season, and then reduce the hours in the winter months to match accordingly with how much activity is going on in site. As I previously stated, the emergency veterinary services will remain in the Roseville location. There would be limited veterinary services at the Grant location. The majority or the focus of this proposed operation is rehabilitation. So not nearly as many veterinary services, much more of this sort of transitional care, which I'm sure the applicant can touch on because he did a great job explaining it when we met him during our pre-application meeting. So from a dimensional standards perspective, we always take a look at this. As I already stated, we've got over 20 acres. We meet all of the lot size, lot area, frontage requirements, et cetera, for both the existing principal structure and actually the number of accessory buildings, because we don't limit that as part of parcels that are over 20 acres. Fencing, we've talked about in previous applications. There are 2 fenced areas that are proposed as part of the application. We don't have a full specification of what those are. We did receive a picture or an image of the type of fence that would be out there, so we can certainly put that up on the overhead for folks who want to see it. But essentially, we don't have a full spec of what that would look like. So if it is 8 feet, it would meet our city code. Our city code basically says if you're outside of all applicable yard setbacks, so meaning front yard, side yard, and rear yard, which these locations are, that you can go up to 8 feet. So my presumption, based on the information provided, is that they are 8 feet. We would need a full fence specification, though, to confirm that that is in fact the case, which is a proposed condition in your staff report tonight. So the site plan is very hard to see on the overhead. I apologize. We can certainly try to pop it up on the overhead and see if that does a little bit better, but I'm not sure that it will. The darker lines that you see up there are the proposed improvements, meaning the structures and the areas that are not currently on the existing parcel. So in lighter gray, which is incredibly difficult to see up here, but in the lighter gray, you can actually see the existing improvements. So you can see the existing homestead, for example, the 12 accessory buildings that we identified. And those dark lines are really the proposed or the activities that would occur. So on the south end, near that ponding area, you can see the waterfowl facility area and the associated cage and the ponds. And then just to the east of the existing homestead, you see the main nursery facility, which is the larger area with a few attached, I believe it's 3 attached caged areas. And then some of the smaller areas denoted are the caged areas as well as the fenced in areas. As I stated, they're proposing that the majority of these improvements would be phased in over time as funding permits, but this is their build-out scenario of what they'd like to see in about 10 years. So from a little bit more of a detailed perspective on the dimensional review, The lot area is acceptable, but I would note that we actually have two parcels that are out here. So there's actually a 15.33 acre parcel and then a 6.68 acre parcel. Just like with the previous conditional use permit, actually, I went back and I took a look at it. The one that has the cell tower on it, we actually required the cell tower conditional use permit to be recorded against both parcels as well. In this case, we would be looking at the same situation of, it's not that the parcels necessarily need to be combined, but for purposes of this operation, in order for the conditional use permit to be valid, it must be recorded against both parcels, and both parcels you can't sell one without the other. Otherwise, it eliminates the conditional use permit, and they would have to come in and either, reduce the number of accessory buildings, change their operations, et cetera. So both parcels have to be included in it. From a setback and a frontage perspective, as I stated, everything really meets all of our yard setbacks. In my narrative or in my staff report, I talked about treating the caged areas as structures, because when you look at what's being proposed, they really fit the definition of a structure, even though in our accessory building standards, for example, we don't have something that directly ties to a caged area one-to-one. So I would recommend that the closest we have are domestic farm animals. We have a 100-foot setback on all of those types of structures from every property line. So I'd propose that we actually implement that rule as part of this. So if you were to do that and look at the site plan, everything meets it with the exception of the caged areas that are attached to the main nursery building. The cage that is on the south edge of that does not meet the 100-foot setback from the property line, and is setback about 75 to 80 feet. So staff would recommend that that be reconfigured so that we meet the 100 feet on all edges. I already touched on the waterfowl facility and the caged area and that wetland edge. When you scale it off from where the presumed edge of the wetland is today, it appears that it would meet the setback. However, we would need to do a delineation, have them do a wetland edge determination to make sure that it actually does meet it. So that's from a structural setback perspective. We want to make sure that we're actually set back the minimum 50 feet and then 10-foot no build buffer on top of that. So it's very, very close right now, but without actually having that edge delineated, I can't say for certain that it meets it. So before that were to be constructed, we would want to make sure that that edge was delineated. I would note in terms of the wetland rules and how it works. So in Minnesota, wetland delineations are good for 5 years. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they have to go out and do this next spring, for example, because if they don't plan to build the waterfowl facility for 7 years, that edge determination will expire by the time that they would actually want to construct the facility. So we actually would want to make sure that it's just a condition of before any building permit is acquired for it, so that we make sure that we have the most current and up-to-date edge determination on that wetland when and if that structure were to be constructed. So food for thought when we go through the conditions or the draft conditions that are before you this evening. As I stated, the accessory buildings, we don't have a limit on them. When we look at the total square footage that's in play, if you will, on the sites, it's approximately 38,000 square feet, let's call it. That's a lot of accessory structure space. Not all of it is new. Obviously, a good portion of it is new, but there's a lot of existing space that's out there as well. In my staff report, I talk about the fact that depending on how much earthwork is happening out there and how much grading work is happening out there, that it may trip an MPDS permit, for example, which is something that the city engineer takes a look at. The threshold for that is 1 acre. So if we're disturbing more than 1 acre of land, then that trips all of those requirements into play. So we have to kind of monitor it and see it. The way I've drafted the staff report is to say that we need to look at it collectively so that it's not that you do one project here and one project there. And if you do it that way, obviously you're not ever going to get to that 1 acre. So we need to kind of look at it comprehensively, determine if there's going to be an acre of disturbance on the site, and then make sure that the proper permits come out of that. So that's something that typically the city engineer takes a look at. Parking area and circulation. So the proposed site plan identifies a parking area, but it does not determine or identify what type of parking material is proposed. It's really an area, so there's no proposed, striping or how many spaces, et cetera. Our city's ordinance does have a ratio calculation to determine how many spots could be accommodated based on the area that was provided. So if you go through that math, which is in the staff report, it results in about 14 spaces on the site. So when you look at the narrative at full build out, at any one time, it appeared that there could be up to 35 cars parked on the site. Now, that would be an absolute maximum, but based on the way the narrative is written, so I think there might be a mismatch between the number of parking places that are being provided and the full build-out situation. So unless the applicant has information to suggest otherwise or could clarify the narrative, staff would suggest that we need a bigger parking area to accommodate the full build-out. In addition to that, we do need to have full plans for what is actually being constructed. So we require on conditional use permits with this type of use that typically that the parking area has to be a dustless surface. There are various ways that can be accomplished, which we've looked at on previous conditional use permits, like the wedding barn, for example, where we've looked at how do you treat a gravel parking lot to make sure that you have a dustless surface, those types of things. So once we look at how big it needs to be, then we need to have the actual specs of that parking lot. The other thing that comes into play, which we need to work with the building official, is whether or not once the main nursery facility is constructed, I don't think it would happen prior to that, whether or not there's any requirement that we have ADA compliant parking stalls in that parking lot. The main nursery facility sounds like a fairly extensive facility based on the narrative of what they'd like to see. And I believe based on the commercial building code that there might be some ADA compliance issues in terms of making sure that we have a parking spot. So that's something that we need to connect with the building official. It's a little bit tricky because we don't actually have the plans for that. So we might have to be creative if it's something that you want to entertain. We'll have to be creative on how we write that condition. But essentially, if the building is a commercial building and we need ADA compliant stalls, we have to figure out where they are and they need to match and meet the commercial building code. The existing driveway on the site, lucky for the applicant, was actually improved to fire lane standards for the cell tower. So from that perspective, it actually meets the standards that we're looking at. Staff would note that because we've got this potential parking discrepancy or deficiency, that parking cannot be accommodated on that drive lane. That drive lane has to remain open and it has to be passable, and emergency vehicles have to get to and from. So we can't accommodate extra parking on that drive lane, and so staff would recommend that there be a condition tied to that because that's not a good alternative. Accessory buildings, I've already touched on the majority of this. I'm just going to scan it to see. We talked about the phasing. There are, I believe, 7 specific conditions that staff drafted in the staff report this evening related specifically to architectural and building standards. Because the applicant is proposing to phase this, and this would be a development or a structure that would be constructed in the future, they provided some architectural styles or samples and sample imagery. That imagery is consistent with the types of accessory buildings that we see all over the city. So from that perspective, it's consistent with what we generally look at. It is reasonable that there isn't a full building plan based on the proposed phasing of the activities on the site. But the way staff addressed it in your conditions is to say, these are the images that would be placed on file. This would be put with the conditional use permit. If you were to change your proposal from this drastically, it may require an amendment to this permit. So if you decided to change locations on the site plan, if you decided to change the building or the architectural style from what you proposed in the application, any of these things could trip the potential for an amendment to the permit. So because it's a future condition, it's one of those, like, this is what we reviewed, and if you're consistent with that, this is probably acceptable. But if you start to vary or depart from what you've submitted, then you would need to come back, and we would do this all over again and have another public hearing. So other standards and additional clarifications from the narrative, the lighting plan, there's really none proposed. I believe there was a statement in there about that the wildlife also like dark skies. So from that perspective, there's nothing really proposed from that, from an improvement or, lighting the driveway or those types of things aren't proposed currently. From a utility perspective, there's an existing septic system that exists out there that supports the existing home. If you read the narrative, there are improvements contemplated in the future, especially in that main nursery facility, that would likely make that septic system not big enough and not having enough capacity to support the new improvements. So staff has suggested that before any building permit of any type could be obtained on the property, that the applicant would have to actually go through septic design with Washington County Environmental Services. So without doing that, we wouldn't give a building permit. So as you know, but for those members in the audience that are here tonight, we don't issue the septic permits. That is Washington County Environmental Services. So they would have to go through that design process. They'd have to provide us with the evidence that that septic design is adequate and supports the facilities that are being proposed and that there's adequate area, et cetera. Without that, no building permit. Waste management, this one was a little bit trickier because actually we just talked about this at our last meeting with the horses and manure management. This is a slightly different situation. These aren't domestic farm animals. These are wildlife. We don't actually have wildlife conversion factors in our ordinances, as you might imagine. So from that perspective, it's unclear whether the MPCA has any specific requirements with respect to any sort of management of waste. My quick and dirty review of it was I could not find anything, but this is such an anomaly in terms of the type of use that I don't want to tell you for certain that there's absolutely nothing. So from that perspective, staff has suggested that the applicant needs to contact the MPCA, ensure that there aren't special requirements or permits that need to be obtained with respect to that. I don't believe that there are based on what I've been able to find, but I want to put it out there because it's certainly something we've talked about previously. Surface water management, this is again one of those tricky pieces because there's no immediate improvements that are being proposed. There is the statement of if they're going to disturb more than 1 acre that trips a certain amount of requirements. No matter what, they are going to disturb more than 50 cubic yards. Therefore, a grading permit for any activities out there are going to be required. That grading permit review goes through the city engineer, and that typically happens prior to a building permit. So that review, that grading permit review would happen concurrently to when there's actually a structure that's being proposed. So at this time, because we're not proposing any structures, we don't have a grading plan because we don't have the exact building permit. So it's a little bit tricky. However, it's pretty standard that our city engineer reviews the grading permit concurrently to the building permit review if it's over 50 cubic yards. Fencing, we talked a little bit about already. Staff is requesting that a detailed specification be provided for both of the fenced areas. If they're different or if they're the same, either way, we need to have an actual fence detail that shows us the height and the material, et cetera. Other agencies, actually the first time that I met the applicant, we met with the watershed district because there was some conversation about the location, for example, of the waterfowl facility and those ponding and cage areas down by the wetland and the pond area to see what Browns Creek Watershed District, what their opinion was or what their feedback was. So they are well aware of the project. At the current moment, they were in the position of feeling like there wasn't a whole lot from their perspective that they had to say about it. If there are new structures that are proposed, then some of their requirements start to trip in. But at this time, they were really saying it's really a city review process and a use review process, which is probably accurate. They did talk about the wetland setbacks, which I covered already. So for any improvements that happen on that edge, There was some discussion about being able to use the existing pond or having to create their own areas. I think that the proposed plan reflects that conversation where they've got the caged and ponding areas that are adjacent to but not in the pond and the wetland area on that southern edge. The grading work and stormwater management may require additional permitting. We touched on that. That is something that actually would generally be led by our city engineer. However, he would work in coordination with the watershed district because some of their rules do get tripped sometimes. So that would be at the time that we're looking at a specific building. Washington County, it is a county road, so typically they look at any change in use, which this would qualify as. I haven't heard back from them yet, but I'm in contact with them. This is not a huge departure from a traditional single-family property with a conditional use permit, which we have all over the place, so I'm not anticipating a lot, but they may have a comment or two with respect to that access location. So actually, I should have adjusted this. It's not a resolution, it's just your staff report this evening that has several conditions at the back of it. I started to populate them and realized that that you could not read them, and so, on the screen. So if there's any specific conditions you have questions about or that the audience is curious whether they exist or not, we can address it, I think, verbally, and that's probably just as effective. So from that perspective, that is that's my whole presentation. I'm sorry it was very long tonight, but I can answer any questions you might have. Or the applicant can, if it's something that I don't know.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody have some questions for Jennifer?
Do I understand correctly, then there is not a fence around the total area? It's just the particular fenced areas that are called out on the
That's
on
correct.
the drawing?
That's correct. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, actually, when staff met with the applicant, we talked a little bit about that, whether or not there would be a desire by the community or to actually fence the whole property. And from the perspective of other conversations we've had, it seems that fencing small areas is likely a better approach than trying to create walls around an entire 20-acre parcel, essentially. So that was the direction that they went in.
Jennifer, how did you arrive at the estimated number of parking spaces they may potentially need of 35 when they only, in the narrative, it suggested maybe 14, I believe it was?
So the narrative suggested 14, but then in the narrative, they state that 20 to 25 volunteers may be on site at a given time. And then 5 interns, so that's 30, and then potentially others that are working at the facility coming in and out. So I just gave it a couple more and said 30 to 35. So the way the narrative is drafted with the 20 to 25, I read it 2 or 3 different times because it could be taken as that 20 to 25 across the whole day. But then there is a statement in there that makes me believe that it's possible that all those volunteers could be there at one time. So if that's the case, then we need a maximum build out to accommodate all of them. If it's not, which the applicant can certainly clarify, we could figure out what that volunteer number is, add it to the number of interns who may all have vehicles, figure out the number of trips that they're from the hospital making over, and, give a little bit of a buffer to make sure that there's enough space. But that's where the number came from.
Okay.
Yeah, just a little more on the parking. I have a concern about that because in their narrative, it says right here that a total of about 50 people at the site at any given time between 7 and 11. So I think 35 parking spaces may not be adequate if they're really going to have 50 people at any given time. And I don't see carpooling, volunteers being there, that sort of thing. I think that we need to be closer to 50.
My interpretation was that it was 2 people per vehicle. See, this is
Yeah,
where
but
we need the
I
clarification.
have a hard time with that in this location and for this use, that it's not like a family going to a restaurant where
Right.
you might have 4 people in a car. It's, people are gonna be showing up, by and large, in my opinion, one at a time.
Anybody else?
Jennifer? I think as of first of the year, it's not Browns Creek anymore. That is Rice Creek that's over there involved. They were changing around some of those boundary areas that
They-
are in there?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, they were, but I believe this one went in. We can-
It stayed in Browns
And it
Creek?
actually, it pulled in the other. So like, actually, Rice Creek and Browns Creek split it,
Yeah.
and I believe this one went to Browns Creek. We can double check, but we met with Browns Creek. It was cold, so I know it was recently. It wasn't like the summer.
And I also know about the due diligence that's been done on this, and they should let the applicant know that we can shoot guns out here. We can shoot them all day long. It's part of what we can do out here. And you've got people that are gonna be doing a lot of hunting, a lot of shooting in that area. You've got the red barn with the red roof on it that's right next to them. And that's set up by the state. That's for shooting off fireworks. And that's what the guy does. So I'd hate to see them come down and say, no more hunting, no more shooting, no more of the stuff over the head. You're taking a guy's business away from him. We also have got somebody that's lives over there that right now is in Mexico, and they fly short planes, the ultralight around, and they do balloons. We went through this 10 years ago out here, and he can do that. And because other neighbors were complaining about the horses and the wildlife running. This is somebody that putting in their statements, they want a nice quiet area for these rehabilitation of these animals, and it's not. It's the opposite of what's going on. Just want them to be aware of this, so if they come down, they're gonna have some problems with it. And I also read those letters, they should go in and read in about the neighbors that lived there that couldn't make it and their concerns about what's going on. We've all just got copies of them. Are they gonna go into the record?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, all of the written testimony gets provided and goes into the public record for the public testimony during the public hearing.
Okay, they will, okay.
Will.
And then also, this is a board that runs this place. When do they have their meetings, what time and where? Maybe that's the applicant that would have to answer that, but I would like to know those three questions.
Okay, anybody else?
I guess in the narrative here, there's a lot of things that they say they're going to do, from bagging waste and removing it to how they're gonna dispose of animals that pass away. I don't see all of that stuff in the conditions. I think one of the things that we should look at is, if they say they're going to do something, that we put that in the conditions, because the board may change in 3, 4, 5 years, and they may see these things differently. And I don't think if this gets approved that we want animal disposal on site, animal releases on site, all of those sorts of things that they say they're not going to do. I think we should really make sure that those items are in the conditions to hold them accountable in the future. And there's a huge list of items, everything from disposal of animals, animal waste, in particular, the duck pond waste. There could be hundreds of waterfowl here at a given time, and I have 40 chickens off and on, and I know the waste generated there, and the waste generated from an artificial pool with hundreds of ducks in it is substantial, and I'd hate to have that going, whether the MPCA says we can or not, have that going into the pond with adjoining neighbors. So I think, those are things that need to be addressed up front and put in the conditions. How are they gonna do these things?
Very good. Does anybody else have any?
I just had one other additional question relating to traffic. Jennifer, were there any discussions about the percentage of animals that were going to be treated at the Grant facility versus Roseville? In the narrative, they provided an extensive chart, but didn't differentiate what would be in Grant, what would be in Roseville, or at least they didn't give any estimates.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I'm actually gonna let the applicant touch on that.
Okay.
We talked about it verbally, but then it wasn't clear in the narrative, I agree, so that is certainly something we can ask for some clarification on.
Yep.
Okay, are you all done with questions? I'd like to hear a motion to open public hearing.
So I'll make a motion.
Second.
A second.
We have a motion and a second at 7:19 to open public hearing. Before we get our first person up there, I'd like to remind everyone, if you are going to speak at the podium here, please sign the sheet first, then talk, so that Kim has a record. All right. Anybody would like to be first to come up and talk? Or wait a minute. We should interview I'm jumping ahead of myself. We need to hear from the applicants first, then we'll start public hearing. Take that back. Would the applicant wish to get up and speak?
Come to here, or where would you like me to?
Right there.
Right here? Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Phil Jenny. I'm the Executive Director of the Wildlife Rehab Center. I've been at the center for 17 years.
Please sign in on that paper you just did.
Okay,
It's underneath your
that I
paper.
covered up here,
Yeah.
will do. I'll sign in while I'm talking here, so I'm not wasting so much time. We appreciate the opportunity to come before you with this proposal. We are an unusual operation, and we expect there to be a lot of questions and possibly concerns about what we do. In a nutshell, we're an emergency hospital for wild animals. We started as part of the University of Minnesota Vet School back in 1979. We were a sister organization of the Raptor Center. We grew out of that space, built a new purpose-built wildlife facility in Roseville in 2002. And one of the things that we've found is that wildlife rehabilitation it's like your retirement stocks right now. It's just going off the charts. There is so much interest in it. I'm an old guy who grew up in a rural area in Wisconsin, and I can guarantee you that when I was a kid, people weren't taking squirrels to Milwaukee to get emergency medical care. But they do now. We're permitted by the state of Minnesota, by the Department of Natural Resources, to take in animals from throughout Minnesota and also Wisconsin and Iowa. As such, we're the only facility in the upper Midwest that can take injured animals from other states as well. Our primary patients are backyard animals, the kinds of things that people see in their backyards. We were started because the Raptor Center only cared for birds of prey, and that was the time when the bald eagles particularly were under attack. But there were vet students at that time who thought, well, what about all the cardinals and chickadees and squirrels that might get injured? Shouldn't we have a hospital for them as well? So that's how we really got started. And to this day, our top 5 admits, our patients we call them, are rabbits, squirrels, wood ducks, ducks, and robins. So they're, small, regular backyard birds. Now, back to the thing about people taking animals to, Milwaukee for care. We're a hospital, we're an emergency hospital, so it's not up to us to decide what animal gets saved and what animal doesn't get saved. We don't make judgments about, everybody's got their own favorite nuisance animal. For some it's bats, for some it's raccoons, but I guess the easiest way to say it is that we're like a hospital, and if something happened to me, I wouldn't want to go down to Regions Hospital and say, well, there's too many old white guys, so we're not going to help him. It's the same thing here. There might be too many squirrels. That's not what we do. What we're really in the business is responding to the current public need for some place to help wild animals. We see a ton of families. You see these little kids in the summer, they're walking up the sidewalk with their box, and it's got a nest of baby bunnies in it, or ducks or something like that, and they don't even know what it is, and they just want to help. And in a way, what we've been able to do then is to provide a way for parents to show compassion. So it's as much about caring for the wildlife as it is for just general care for the environment and wildlife. The specifics of this proposal is because there's been this enormous growth, we've grown 80% in 5 years. Our space in Roseville, we're landlocked. We have a land lease with the city of Roseville in Roseville's Central Park. So they're our landlord, basically, and we've been there for 17 years. There is not enough space there to accommodate particularly all the small baby animals that we admit. And you could also argue that it'd be like for those patients to be at our place, it's like going to the emergency room with a cold, too. They don't need high-test veterinary care. They just need some place that they can grow up and be wild. Most of them are what we'd call habituated animals. They're not animals that are necessarily frightened of people. A squirrel is not, a frightened squirrel is not going to live very long, because they have to be able to live around people. So what happens is at Roseville, animals come in the front door. Most of our business last year, we took in almost 15,000 animals. About 9,000 of those animals were what we call nursery animals. That means they were babies. Somebody's dog attacked a nest of baby bunnies, killed the mom, and then the little babies there. Families brought those animals in. We don't go and get anything. Everything that comes to us is brought to us by members of the public, so they self-select to come to us as well. And then at that process, they are, if they're healthy, they're basically housed together, and then they get into progressively bigger and bigger cages. And like in the case with waterfowl, at a certain point, it's pretty hard to have several hundred waterfowl in a 20 by 30 foot room. So what we really want to do with the grant proposal is really to be able to move the healthy orphaned animals out of our current location out here where there is more room, where we can provide sufficient space and caging for them. The caging and the fencing we've talked about is we double cage things. So there's a perimeter fence, and then within that perimeter fence there are additional cages, as much to protect our patients as much as anything else. And we're very much aware of, this is a rural area, and hunting is allowed. It would be difficult to shoot a baby squirrel through all the fencing that we've got though out there. So it's not something that we're horribly concerned about being in a hunting area. We also do have some experience with the waterfowl because we currently have an off-site for our waterfowl down in Invergrove Heights. The problem is the guy he's basically letting us use the land for free. He's 83 years old. We don't have any guarantee that after he passes we'll be able to do anything there. There's not enough room to do the mammals. What we'd like to do eventually is to be able to consolidate our nursery site away from Roseville. So that's why some of these plans are phased in. We're a nonprofit. We need to do anything. We need to raise money. And that's why we don't see really doing anything other than retrofitting some of the existing buildings so that we can get some space immediately to take the pressure off our Roseville facility. We're in the beginning stages of a capital campaign where we would need to raise the rest of the money, and that's why even the siting on the proposed site map is more a matter of scale than position. So all of the conditions that are outlined in your report, we don't have any problem with any of those. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of a background. Any questions for me?
I think I'll go first then. In your write-up, or our write-up, I guess it is, it said that you try to release animals once they're rehabilitated
Yep.
as close as you can to where they were found.
Right.
How do you do that?
We take pretty detailed, we're required to do that by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Natural Resources, because they're concerned about, you take in, say, a raccoon from Hudson, Wisconsin, you don't want to release it, somewhere else because of disease. The whole chronic wasting disease thing that's happening now is a perfect example of that. So what we do is we take, we have a very precise thing when a person comes in. Doesn't matter where you live, it matters where you found the animal. So if it's an adult, it gets released back where it was found. So if somebody finds, say they've got a cabin up on, up north somewhere, and they're driving somewhere and they hit something and it's still alive and they decide they want to help it, they put it in a box, bring it down to us, we get it fixed up. We actually then take it back up to where they found it. So I call it magnificently illogical, especially for an old guy from a rural area in Wisconsin. But it is just as another little factoid, the University of Minnesota admits about 100 vet students each year, right? And over the last decade, they asked them if they're interested in domestic exotics like zoos or birds or something like that, whether it's health care, and the whole intersection between animals and people, and then wildlife medicine. And right now, nearly 3/4 of those students who are entering vet school want to be wildlife veterinarians. And there's about 50 jobs around the country, and they're all already taken by people who are 35 years old. So it's a horrible career choice, but the interest is astonishing. So,
One thing I was curious about, you said that this site would be closed to the public.
yes.
But then I was a little concerned because I read further on in your comments that you might, a bird release, volunteer picnic, a donor release, or migratory birds. Are you planning events of some type there?
No.
Whether there be staff events that would increase noise and traffic to the location?
That's a good question. I mean, I could envision us having a work day in the spring where the volunteers come out and, clean up, and if that's something the city would prefer we don't do it. I mean, that's not a big deal for us. The thing with wild animals in the rehab system cannot be put on public display. So we can't have tours at our place in Roseville, so we couldn't have tours out here. People who are in our volunteer pool are able to care for animals, and they're covered by our permit with DNR. But just a random member of the public, we wouldn't be having coming out here for any kind of an event.
What's the largest animal that you treat or take care of?
We the largest one that we're permitted to care for is, Minnesota has 5 what they call big game. They're the biggest animals, and white-tailed deer and bear are the 2 that we're allowed to treat. So moose and wolves, can't remember what the 5th one is, we're not allowed to treat. It's not common. Like I say, we've got more than half of our patients come from those 5 that I mentioned. We get an awful lot of really little patients, warblers, hundreds of warblers that come through in the spring, run into somebody's window, and people bring them into us.
I asked that question before. You have a board?
Yes.
When do
yes,
they meet?
Yep. Our board meets the 3rd Tuesday of every month. We met at noon today. We meet at noon at our Roseville facility, 2530 Dale Street.
And the public's invited. Also, I think you misunderstood me when I was talking about shooting out here. That's all the time. It's not hunting season, so if I'm a neighbor next to you, I can shoot 50, 100 rounds a day or whatever it is.
Yep.
I just want you to be
Yeah.
aware of that
Right.
Because you stated you want nice, quiet and
Yeah.
everything for these animals, and it's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
But I just want you to be ahead.
Thank you.
And aware of it, because there might be some lawsuits down the end here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Where we share land for waterfowl now, the owner there has actually, working with DNR, has a shooting range for children for teaching kids how to handle guns. So, and believe me, it's a lot different even with that than, say, where we are in Roseville. You know, and probably more important than anything, with wild animals, it's not even so much that those kinds of noises, even though they might be loud, it's really predators, and we're predators. So the less they have to do with people, the better off they are. That's why all the design of our caging too is to really keep them away from, you know, the roads. They'll hear all that, obviously, but
Okay, I haven't met one person that wants you out here. I mean, you can do all the stuff you do legally here, but none of your neighbors want you, that I know of. So why would you come out to someplace where you're not welcome?
well, we don't know we're not welcome till we come out and go through the process. So
There'll be some people speaking, I think, tonight. You'll get-
I'm happy to answer any questions and appreciate the opportunity to do so.
I'd like to keep this straight for me, at least. The two hospitals you've mentioned, Rosedale and the other one, they are the ones that actually people bring,
Yeah, only to Roseville, yes.
only Roseville.
Only Roseville.
So
yeah.
you get, the only animals you get come from Rosedale. Nobody shows up at your structure if it were here.
No.
Okay.
No.
So the emergency work is done.
Yes, and every animal that comes in gets triaged there, and if it's healthy, it's still, everything that comes in is gonna stay in Roseville for a little while. When it gets to the point where it needs more space, you know, we need bird cages. You can't keep, 50 small chickadees or whatever it is in a tiny room. They need more outdoor space, so that's what we're
Okay.
talking about.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll try to get back to our public comments, and
Sure.
then we'll talk again.
Yeah, I do have, I don't know if I should, I guess these were in the packet though.
Those are in the packet.
When we're talking about fencing, and if you saw that in there, it's not like, we're not proposing still water, it's really just the it's the perimeter fencing to keep stuff out.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer, Ms. Points, as a nonprofit, do they pay any property taxes towards this? Or are they off the books? You know about that? I've had quite a few people ask me, do they pay taxes for property? You guys know what?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I can't answer that without knowing more about the organization and the structure, et cetera, but
It was just questions that people were asking me about it. Because they want to know what they contribute to us.
Hey, we're
What
gonna get back to questioning him again. You can,
Okay,
can ask him.
okay, thank you.
okay, now I gotta get back to the mistake I made, and keep open the public comments. Lauren, would you like to be first? Break the ice? Where do I sign in? Right there, we want your autograph.
Okay, well, I spent several hours this afternoon going over the codes, and as some of you know, I've been on the planning commission and council. So rather than just rattle a bunch of stuff off that doesn't make any sense, I printed it off so you guys can follow, I want to be short and sweet, I don't want to take too much of your time.
You wanna knock that one over so we get all of them down? Thanks.
My appointment with the Sister Kenny Institute tomorrow. So, okay, anyway, I just went through some of this stuff, and Wildlife Rehabilitation of Minnesota. I went to their website and quote, "One of the nation's busiest hospitals admitting 15,000 patients annually." That's from their website. Well, also on the website, they say this includes coyotes. The point I'm making, this is a commercial operation which will bring extensive traffic to our quiet neighborhood from the volunteers. They also have planned in the future, and it isn't nailed on, I know it's future, 7 to 10 accessory buildings, some 30 by 60 and some 30 by 70. Okay, then we go to the next item. I have their wildlife preserve. And out of the code, it's 32.245. Well, it says wildlife preserve, and they do not meet the definition of what a wildlife preserve would be. Okay, next page. I know I'm going fast. I don't want to waste your time. Okay, then we go to section 6.20, and they talk about wild animals and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So, and you can read that. I'm not going to go over it. You gentlemen, probably have seen some of this anyway, but I'm just bringing it to memory. Then the last one I put on is animal units in 32.337. And I realize that there's no, like for example, Jennifer was talking about the animal manure. They have lots of documentation on that for cows and horses and things. But there I thought it would be helpful to have an animal unit comparison where like one turkey is 0.018 and the chicken is 0.01. So you can kind of see how it transfers. And I think this is great. I just think the plans are way too nebulous. I've seen from like 7 to 10 things coming up. I think it's going to have a lot of traffic. There's a lot of people on that road that have smaller lots. And this is a quiet neighborhood. And I think it's commercial, it isn't really a good fit. I mean, yeah, I know they have the wildlife up in Sandstone. They have the large cat refuge. My daughter was an attorney, used to be on their board. But again, this is a commercial venture in a residential neighborhood, and I don't necessarily think that would be the good fit. It is an agricultural. I mean, if it was like horses, they have a boarding facility. There's all kinds of delineations on that, but this really doesn't fit the spot. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Please come up. Don't forget, we want your autograph.
I'm not sure you'll be able to read my autograph, so I'll just write my name.
Not my job, that's Kim's.
I'll still make it good for Kim.
Okay.
First off, my name is Mark Hollerman, and I live on 107th Street, directly across the street from this piece of property.
Okay.
I just have a few comments. To me, this is a new commercial enterprise for the area, and since it's for wild animals instead of domestic, it would seem to me to be inconsistent with an agricultural zoning. Because in my mind, agriculture means domestic. Since it's a new commercial enterprise, it would seem to me to be incongruent with the, quote, vision that I have heard expressed for other proposals. Specifically, I'm referring to the example of the solar farm that was recently denied. I'd like to point out, I believe the conditional use permit for the cell tower included something about that requiring both parcels to stay together. Therefore, it reinforces the need to keep those two together regardless. I would personally prefer not, if this goes through, not to see a fence go entirely around the whole system. I would consider that to be unsightly. I am concerned about release of animals. I'm going to have to rely on the applicant's honor that they will take them other places. They stated that it's their law, that they have to follow the law. I appreciate that, because I certainly don't want any more squirrels or raccoons in the neighborhood. They're nice, but they raid my bird feeder all the time. I did some reading on this. I appreciate one of the commission members coming to my house and alerting me to this, although I did get the letter. So it gave me some time to do some more research. After doing the research, I think the proposal, as it's placed, I'm kind of neutral on it. I'm not against it. I'm not necessarily going to say I support it. I'm kind of neutral on it. As long as it stays the way it is, and as long as access stays coming off of County 9, I guess I really can't really raise any major objections on that. So that's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sure, go ahead. But both your names on there, too.
I don't know, I've never done this before. I've been here 25 years. My
What are
name
your
is
names?
Julie Buttermore, and my
Scott.
husband Scott.
We are the boundary on the
East
of the,
lot line. We will be their next door neighbor.
Okay.
And our main concern, it was also about perimeter fencing along our property line, which would be very unsightly and concerning. And, you know, maybe now that's not in the proposal, but who's to say even 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line? And I guess you could say that for any neighbor. So I would just, our number one concern is our property value. We rely.
don't know if you have any real estate agents that can give you an opinion on that. And I like what you do, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, we do.
But if it's gonna affect my property value, I don't want them there.
We just,
Do not want them there.
yeah,
And
we have
It
to be
does seem like a
concerned about
commercial property to me, more than City of Grant, a home in the country.
We moved out to this area because of the rural, that's what we brag about in Grant, is our rural feel. And to have a business, even though it's wildlife, just doesn't seem like it's a neighborhood anymore.
And then looking at the projections of growth, there's gonna be a lot of people out there in 5 years if they keep going the way they're going. Coming and going all day long and night, you know. And I just like to keep it rural. I think that's gonna be, too much of a, I don't wanna say a zoo out there. I mean, if you read through everything, their growth has been unbelievable in the last 5 years. And I don't see it stopping if they're doing that well now. I mean, I didn't know people brought squirrels and stuff to a rehab place before I read this. You know, and little Tweety birds and stuff, but,
Think different than we do.
yeah, exactly, so, what's that?
So,
Yeah, mice, I mean, we ran into friends of ours last night at dinner, and they actually go here, they're out in the country too, they're in Hugo, and they bring squirrels and stuff to these guys,
Wow.
you know? So I do appreciate what they do.
Yeah,
But
I-
if it's gonna affect my property values, not worth it
Understood.
to me.
Thank you very much for your
so, and I
comments.
just want to say too, you know, I kind of agree with Mark about, you know, we're not opposed, but we would ask if this is going to be happening, we would ask you to be neighborly. You're in a neighborhood. And respect my pond view right now. We have a view of that pond.
I know, I saw that.
You
It's
do know
beautiful.
that?
Yes.
I mean, do you want to see a picture that I just took?
No, I walked the
I
property
want to
with Ricky
show
before.
you, and you know what, you're not gonna be around in 10 years when whoever comes along, or maybe you will, but.
She's cruel, watch out.
I'm not guaranteeing, but right now, that's my pond view. And look at that sunset, and if I have to look at an ugly fence.
35-foot tall building or something.
Okay, and then I also have a question, can I ask this? Has the property been acquired? Did they purchase it already? Can you answer that, or?
We'll find that out in,
So we don't even know that yet? Okay. And then the fence around it was a concern, and then is there any regulation, another concern of mine? Does it get inspected, or once they own it, is it just a free-for-all, and are they able to do whatever they want? Those are
yeah,
concerns.
we're not supposed to
Those are
converse like
that's
this.
okay.
Right, right.
That point was
Okay, I'm
covered by
voicing
a
my
question
concern.
he asked during the last,
And I would say if you put that in, the conditional use permit that you put
Yeah.
in, it's limited
He
to
asked
the
for it
number
to
of
be put
buildings
in.
they've already
Yep.
requested,
Okay.
and no more, because at 20 acres and over, they can put whatever they want in unless you have it in there, I think.
All right.
thank you very much. Is there anybody else? Yeah, there's a hand out there.
I am also a neighbor of some of the other folks that were up here. I live on 107th Street North, directly across from the house that's on that plot, that lot right now.
What is your name, by the way?
Oh, I'm sorry, Lee Becker.
Lee Becker? Okay,
Yep.
thank you, Lee.
And so my being up here is mostly to ask questions. I didn't get the handout until my neighbor showed it to me just as I was walking in, slightly late. But one is just like the excrement and the waste. How is that going to be cleaned up? I'm going to be facing them probably more because I want to. They're the experts supposedly.
That's true.
So, if you don't know, I mean, that's something that needs to be covered.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd like to know about animal noises, because anytime you've got an animal that's hurt, they're going to be making noises. And in this area, and a lot of areas around Grant and other Washington or other counties, we have coyotes. And I certainly don't want to bring more coyotes anywhere near the neighborhoods around where I live. And I'm sure they don't either. It's hard to I don't know what you can even do to block the noises anyway. And as much I have a concern about squirrels. I like all animals. I do like what you guys do. I hope something can be found, but squirrels can be very nasty, not just stealing people's foods, but if they get into your roof, they can cause thousands of dollars of damage. I used to be in pest control, I know this. And they're really, really hard varmints to catch if you want to catch them. A lot of times we had to take them as far as, minimally it was like 5 to 10 miles away. Otherwise a squirrel or raccoon would find its way back. Now I don't think you guys are dealing with raccoons anyway, but one of the problems is it's going to draw a lot of predators like coyotes, eagles, other raptor birds that like small animals. And that makes a risk for our own pets. Because, obviously eagles, which you probably heard, they can lift a pretty heavy animal. And you'll never see them again. Or if you do, you don't want to be looking at them. I want to know about funding. As this establishment grows, are the taxpayers going to be demanded to give a percentile to the government to fund this thing? That's a concern. I think I read that you guys get 73% you get donations up to 73%, but where does the other 27% come from? And will that number probably most likely change in the near future? I don't have a problem with the fence. I didn't have that on my notes, but I would definitely want that fence backed up behind the shrub and the foliage and stuff like that, so the fence can't be seen. And the thing with the squirrels is important because they can get up any fence, as you know. You could build that fence and put an L on it, and they'd still find a way to get over that fence. So I'd like to know how especially the squirrels are going to be taken care of, that they don't get away, that they're not drawing coyotes. And it'll be a little bit of as Scott mentioned, the one previous to me and Julie, that it does deface I've got concern about that too, that it would probably have a deface of our home values and that kind of thing, but I guess that's more of a concern to me than the fence would be. So that's really all I got. I just One of the things, I guess, what I would like you guys to consider is to have, consider as a motion, maybe a provisional permit where the health department does inspect them once or twice a year, and that you get feedback from the nearby citizens to find out if we're having any problems, like over, say, after 2 years or 3 years. I mean, I'm realistic enough to say that, no, we're gonna do this the first 9 months or 6 months or whatever, but I think it's only practical that they are given time, which I would think is realistic if it's 2 or 3 years. If everything is working out and there's not like any real big surprises, that kind of a thing. So with that, I will leave us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody else? Come on up. Remember to autograph our paper there.
I will do that. Hi, my name's Tim Retner, and I live on 107th Street, just down the street from where this would be. Everybody's kind of addressed most of my concerns, but something I hadn't heard is you have the facility on Dale Street, or actually in Central Park, which is great, but everything's been talked about how you're growing so big that you can't handle what's happening. When you outgrow that facility, what are your plans? Is it going to be, well, let's move it up here because we have all this space, which then increases the amount of traffic, the amount of animals, and the amount of waste.
Can you
dead
face
animals.
this way, please,
Oh,
for the microphone?
I'm sorry.
Because otherwise, we might not get it recorded. I'm sorry.
Certainly, no, that's fine.
I mean, yeah.
But that would increase the amount of everything that everybody's concerned about. How many animals are coming in, how much traffic is coming in, how much noise, all because everything is growing exponentially with the amount of injured animals that they're seeing. How can they handle that where they're at now? They have to move to this location, outgrow that location. Now we've got an overgrown location here. How do you deal with that? Where are you going to put all the dead animals, all the feces, all the cars, all the traffic, all the noise? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else?
Hi, my name is Wayne Sarapo. I live to the west of this facility, proposed facility. And my concern, I guess I agree with all my neighbors that have brought up these concerns. The only thing I would add in addition is, and my neighbors can verify this, in the summertime, during the terms of your highest use, from spring till October, the motorcycle traffic out on Jamaica is really, really heavy. Sometimes 100 or more motorcycles go by, and it used to be just on Saturdays, but now it's like every day of the week. And then there's a couple of neighborhood kids that race up and down. They've got those crotch rocket type motorcycles, and those make a lot of noise. I'm afraid somebody's going to get hurt. I've called the police about it one time. Because remember, years ago, there was where that curve is, where Jamaica curves to go up toward Withrow, somebody went off that curve and got killed in my neighbor's property. So I'd hate to see that happen again. But it is not a quiet neighborhood anymore, and this would only add to the noise. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I guess it's my turn.
Oh, okay.
Dennis LaValle. I talked to Phil for about 40 minutes the other day. And to answer your question, they've already remodeled the house. They've made improvements. Well, I'm not for the project. And I'm not for the project for multiple of two. I don't think it meets the criteria that is set out in the ordinances. I think it's also part of the planning commission and the city council in which to allow developments and opportunities that maybe are neutral in value and don't decrease value. In my conversation with Phil, he said, well, you know, a lot of people didn't want that property because there's a cell phone tower on there. We don't care if there's a cell phone tower. In fact, it's an addition to us because it's $800 a month in revenues. That's fine. I understand that. What I don't understand is why Pat and Ricky DeMars, Soul of the Earth, fourth generation family, would, how should I say, bastardize themselves for a little bit of money to put a cell phone tower on there. Okay? So, his words, nobody wanted it. I had a conversation with a neighbor last night, and he said, well, hell, they can turn it around and sell it and get $1 million. I said, are you nuts? I says, the reason they sold it for $650 when he was asking $7+ for it, because there's a cell phone tower on it. I was shocked when I saw that cell phone tower going up. I don't open my mail, so I didn't see the thing. In fact, I opened up my mail on Saturday the first time in a year, and I happened to see this notice. That's why I'm here. I figure property values adjacent to it are going to go down 25%. Why? Because when a buyer walks in, takes a special buyer, and he's going to use everything in his power to bring the price down, whether it's legitimate or not. And it's everybody's responsibility to at least have a neutral value with property values. And that's your fiduciary responsibility to the clientele of the city of Grant, number one. Number two, Phil is extraordinaire. He's engaging, he's likable. His job is to raise funds. That's what he gets paid to do. He came from the political world. I didn't ask him what it was. They got their first $1 million donation. They're going to do a major capital raise that they're working on, and they're going to use that as a kickoff. The only reason why this stuff isn't being consolidated in Grant today is because they need the money. If they get a $5 million bill in there, and guess what? To get money, what do you need? Well, we got this beautiful master plan in Grant, City of Grant. People still call it Grant Township. And we need these funds so we can point to it. Well, God, we can help do that. He's selling a dream. I don't fault him for that. He's brilliant. He looked for properties for 2 years. He gave it up. He finally started shopping ordinances where he figures it could fit in. He told me, and I'm not sure I don't disagree with him, I don't need a CUP to do what I need to do. Hence, the building's already remodeled. He's spending more than what he thought he would. He had allocated 50 grand for that. Okay? But it will affect the lady who says, well, I don't know if it's going to affect our property value. Hello? Oh, okay, then I'm hard of hearing, that's why I moved up here.
No, I want to clarify. That
Yeah,
is my
okay,
number one
okay. It is going to affect the property values for everybody there. You know, 25% on my property, that's $100,000. You know, it's only my kids' money someday. It's not mine. And, you know, I said, do you realize everybody out in Grant kills the shit you're trying to save? Okay?
Yeah.
Did we have that conversation? Yeah. We had that conversation.
Not my problem.
Okay, so, you know, I kill like 14 raccoons a year in my sweet corn patch. If I didn't, I wouldn't even get a cob of corn. I hardly get to harvest the apples off the tree because they have them. Possums. Possums. You know, they can kill a horse. But we in Grant kill these items. I get to eat 4 or 5 pigeons a year when they decide they're going to take up one of my barns. Okay, I do not kill the pale-headed woodpeckers that now have 12 holes in the side of my barn about this big. Okay, I respect what he does. I expect he's an intelligent individual. He's engaging. He's dynamic. and he has a lot of charisma, and his job is to raise money. He's got 8,900 donors. They're shareholders, okay? It's if you're a publicly held company, you have shareholders. You have a business plan that is hopefully self-sustaining, so you can give your shareholders something back. He has no self-fulfilling business plan. His job is to build monuments that they can point to raise an additional capital. Because that's his job. That's his income. I don't fault him for any of that. You know what? He should find a nut. And by the way, they looked all over. All over. What they should find is a 200 acre property. They should put it in there. It's maybe further than they want to drive, where they got 4 or 5 neighbors. And I was shocked when he told me he wanted to go around and talk to the neighbors, and somebody from this organization told him not to. You know, it looks like you're selling the project. I think that's asinine. But at the end of the day, it's about property values, and it's about, you know, he's a farm kid. Demirs were a 4th generation farmers. Bastardized themselves, put a fucking cell phone tower on their property. I like Ricky and Pat. I like them a lot. When I saw that cell phone tower, why did they come over? I would have given them that money a month, not to look at that eyesore every day. People would come over. I didn't notice that. You know, it affects the property value. His property, what he's proposing, will affect the property values. Because why? Because people will use it as an excuse. At the end of the day, what else was I thinking about? So, you know, I don't know if he's rigid in that we don't need a CUP to do this. Could end up in court. But again, your guys' responsibility is to take hold your stakeholders. And that's not to reduce property value. There's no way he's not going to affect mine. Ginny across the pond. Everybody, the people across the road is going to be a bit less, and as you go further out, it'll be less. And at some point, it's going to be insignificant, but the people adjacent to that property are going to get hurt. So, I don't want to be up here.
Yeah.
Pisses me off that I have to be here.
Thank you very much.
I want to make a comment on that. Oh, unless, he's that property that's right there, right next to it. When you see on here, that little square, that's his property. So he's right there covered on 3 sides by what they want to do.
Anybody else want to talk? Going on. Okay, it's 8:07, we're going to close public hearing. Or take motions to close public hearing.
I'll make a motion to close public hearing.
Second, okay, a motion and a second. All those in favor of closing, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please say no. There aren't any. Okay.
Oh, I have just one last comment.
No comments from the audience, please. If we start that, we'll never get anything done. Okay.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions of Jennifer or of,
I was going to answer some of their questions, but.
Oh, you were? Well, I'm sticking around.
Can be more discussion.
You might let them know that there is going to be some more discussion if they want to hear.
Follow my agenda, I was like Donald Trump.
No, just the public comments are closed, but we'll be discussing it again.
They're out here.
They need a break.
okay,
probably.
Jennifer. You have the floor.
All right, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, there are items that were brought up that I can't answer, but there are a few things that I can cover that hopefully are helpful to the folks that remain after all of this. So the first one, the question regarding commercial activity in a residential neighborhood or in a residential area. Just for everybody's information and background, we actually have what in the city's code is called the table of uses. And in the table of uses, there are several commercial types of uses that are permitted with conditional use permits. So the example that comes to mind is this particular site, for example, is over 20 acres when combined or considered collectively. It's on a county road, and we would permit a wedding barn or wedding venue similar to what we already have in the county or in the city because it's on a county road. So that is a commercial activity that's in a residential area, but it is a conditionally permitted use. Or a supper club would also be permitted in this zoning district with these criteria. So the way the city's table of uses works, there are commercial uses that are permitted if certain criteria are met and established. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear, that the fact that it's a residential area or it's zoned and guided A1, A2 does not mean that we don't have uses that are permitted that are commercially based. So I just want to make that clear to everybody, that in and of itself does not make it something that can't be done. With respect to the proposed use of being a wildlife rehabilitation center, we don't have that on the table of uses. We don't list every single use there is on our table of uses. So what staff does, and what the council does and the planning commission does is we look at our table of uses and say, what is it the closest to? And if there's nothing on the table of uses that it's close to, then it's not permitted. If there is something that it is close to, then we look at what is the permit or the requirement to go through in order to bring that use to fruition if it's permitted. So in this case, it's actually from staff's estimation based on the proposal, based on what they've identified, it's actually a combination of two uses. It's not purely, it doesn't, and I agree with the gentleman who stated that this does not meet the full definition of a wildlife preserve. I think that is an accurate statement. It has similarities to it in terms of what's being treated or the types of animals that are there being wildlife, which, by the way, is permitted in all of our land use and zoning districts. So there's no conditional use permit. Veterinary services, on the other hand, veterinary clinics are also in our A1, they are a conditionally permitted use. So that requires a conditional use permit. So if you look at the more restrictive process to go through, what we require for a veterinary clinic would be a conditional use permit. Thus, that's more restrictive. That's what we're applying, and that is what they're going through. So staff would say it needs a conditional use permit based on the proposed use. That is why we're here this evening considering the application. So hopefully that helps a little bit in terms of how we got here and why the use is what it is and why it was classified as a conditional use permit. There was a question with respect to whether the property had been acquired. My understanding is the answer is yes. With respect to inspection, and is it a free-for-all as soon as they walk out the door? The answer to that is no. The city of Grant has a process set up for reviewing all conditional use permits. They all are reviewed, actually, all the conditional use permits in the city. We put them on a rolling cycle. So if there are no complaints that are received, we are a complaint-based community. We don't go out and inspect, but all the permits are reviewed. I think it's basically on a 4-year basis. So every 4 years, staff goes out. We make sure that the conditions of the permit are being met. If there are any violations, they are asked to correct them. Our building official works with them, and we ensure that all of the conditions that, as they are drafted, are followed up on. If, however, in the meantime of that cycle, if you will, that we put in place, something happens that a neighbor says, you know what, I think they're in violation of their permit. If they file a complaint, staff goes out, the building official inspects the property, determines whether or not there's a violation of the permit, and we request that it be and follow through on ensuring that it gets corrected to be compliant with the permit. That is why, and this group I know knows this very, very well, that the conditions that we put in the conditional use permit have to be things that we can easily and effectively actually go out and monitor and implement. So there's sometimes there's sort of these innocuous conditions that want to be placed in, but there's no way for staff to actually regulate it. So we try to avoid that. We try to put conditions in like you will maintain all fencing along all perimeter caging, for example, and if it's in disrepair, you will correct it. So it's a very tangible, clear item, something specific. If you go out and see that it's in disrepair and doesn't meet the specification that's on the plan, they have to fix it and correct it. So that's the process in terms of how it works, and it is not a free-for-all. There is a process. There was questions about the waste, squirrel noises, squirrels in general. I can't answer those things because I'm not an expert, so that's something I'm gonna let the applicant take care of. With respect to the market and whether or not it's going to negatively or adversely impact property values, that's the piece I can't answer for you today. It's something that I was contemplating, how could we go about doing this? It's not unusual when you have a use that's coming in to say, how do we get additional information with respect to if it is going to negatively affect or impact property values? I would venture a guess that there's probably not a lot of market research that's been done about wildlife rehabilitation centers, but there might be similar types of uses that we could ask the applicant to look into and provide. There are certainly market studies about adversely impacting adjacent neighbors with specific uses. So there might be something that's similar, whether it be, I was trying to think of what would be most similar, veterinary clinics with outdoor spaces, dog parks. I was trying to come up with what are the similar types of things? And are there existing market studies out there that we could pull to say, how is that affecting adjacent property values? So I think that is certainly something we could ask the applicant to do a little bit of research for us and come back with. He may come up empty-handed, but I think it's worth the question. I think it's a valid concern, and it's something that I don't believe we can answer tonight, from my perspective. But maybe he knows 5 studies off the top of his head. I don't know. I do not. The question was asked about, well, what happens if you outgrow Roseville, and are you just going to put everything out here? The way that the current conditional use permit conditions as they're drafted today state are, you would be permitted only what is on the site plan, even though the number of accessory buildings is essentially unlimited because of our ordinance. The way it's drafted is to say the site plan and what you've submitted is what you're permitted to do with the conditional use permit. Anything beyond that, and you have to amend the permit. So they couldn't just take the operations in Roseville and put them here because this permit would not allow the operations of what's happening in Roseville to happen here. So they couldn't just move it. So they would be limited to the number of buildings, the approximate number of square footage, the approximate locations too. So he made a statement, the applicant made a statement about, well, those can move or this. We actually need, if we get to a place of approving the permit, we actually need a site plan that says this is approximately where we believe this is going to be. And if it departs too far from that, you actually may need to amend the permit so that neighbors can be notified and you can come in and say, you're going to affect my view, or you're going, So the site plan actually does need to be a fairly accurate representation of what's intended. And we need that to be updated, just like we need whatever parking area, if we were to move this forward, the parking area has to accurately depict the size of what that would be, and the buildings need to be in their approximate locations, et cetera. So that's our security, if you will. That's the piece that memorializes this if it moves forward. If the applicant were want to do something different, they would actually need to come back and amend it. So let's see here. I think I've covered everything at a high level that I can. Oh, the health department, there was a question about the health department inspectors and also doing some kind of temporary permit, or you can have this for 3 years and then if everybody sings Kumbaya, we'll let you have the permit concept. The reality is the city's ordinance doesn't have a tool to allow us to do that at this point. So what that concept is really more of an interim use permit, and our current ordinance does not have that. So a conditional use permit runs with the land, and we can't actually restrict the timing on it. So it's not given to the actual property owner, it's given to the land, if you will. And so we don't have the right or the ability to actually time delimit it. So from a statutory perspective, that's a state statute, so we don't have that ability. But we certainly can do things like we could say, for example, that we have a rolling 4-year or 5-year, whatever it is, conditional use permit review cycle. We could say this one needs to be reviewed annually for the first 4 years or whatever it is, so that would be the check. So we could do something like that if there's concern about it. But we can't actually say, and then we'll revoke your permit. The revoking the conditional use permit, we have to follow the same process we would with any other conditional use permit. So I think that covers everything. Best that I can.
Okay. Would you come back up and face the mic again? And
Thank you. Phil Jenny again, I guess for the cameras, wherever they are. There were a couple of other issues that I wanted to address that did come up. On the noise question, our patients don't create a lot of noise. They want to keep their heads down as much as they can. It's not like they're, zoo animals or something. And we're currently in a very dense urban neighborhood in Roseville, and in 17 years have never had anybody say anything to us about smell or noise. And a lot of these animals that we're proposing to come out here are currently in outdoor caging on a deck that we have around our building. So I think that the main thing is rabbits don't do much noise-wise. Birds don't. There aren't a lot of species that want to draw attention to themselves, and especially not when they're caged, because they're also very vulnerable at that point. The other point about attracting predators, it's hard to say. If it does happen, most predators also are territorial, so they'll chase the one out that they don't generally hang out together. There are very few predators that do that. So that's why you don't, and particularly the solitary hunters like coyotes, they typically won't live around another one. They'll push them out. There's already a lot of predator animals in Grant now too, so it's, who knows whether new ones come in or not. That's a really hard one to answer. And that also keeps it, it's not really a zoo because the animals are transitional. They're only there for a short period of time. So the other kind of similar places would be the Wildlife Science Center up in, they moved just recently, but they have captive wild animals on site, and then also the Wildcat Sanctuary, which is where, and they have they're up in Sandstone, and they have large cats, basically. They're a sanctuary for tigers and other kinds of large cats that are confiscated. And so that would be that. Maybe they might even be a comparable for us, I don't know. But the fact is, they're there as permanent residents. None of our animals are permanent. They're in there. The longest any resident, any patient stays with us is typically about 12 weeks. So they're kind of in and out. The question about property taxes is, we're a nonprofit, so we do not pay, we're exempt from property taxes. We have to pay property taxes for 2020 because of the terms of the sale, which occurred in the end of November. But in 2021, we'll be exempt. I had Ricky's, the DeMars's tax thing here, but I don't think I brought it along, how much that they were currently paying in property taxes. The other thing is the question about commercial. Commercial suggests to me, and I don't know if there's a formal definition, but that it's a transactional thing where there's a service provided for money, right? And that is not what we do. We're a nonprofit. It wouldn't be any different if we were the Boys and Girls Club or any nonprofit that you could think of. It's the same thing for us. We're also very proud of the fact that we do not get any state, federal, city, or money from the university or anybody else. We're entirely funded by the public. When somebody quoted the 73%, that's just direct. Me writing out a check for $100. We get donations for admits. We have some families. Our kind of angel donor is a small local foundation, so they're family foundations for the most part. So we don't even, there's very few guidelines that really support animals, and certainly not wild animals. So it's fully funded by individuals. And I can't imagine us ever leaving our hospital in Roseville because of the fact that it's, like you said, it's really a nice, it's on par with the university's small animal hospital at the vet school. It's a very, very well-tooled veterinary hospital. So it would be really almost unthinkable for us to abandon that investment that we made there. We do get back to the inspection thing, and Jill mentioned that too. But we also, the Department of Natural Resources also inspects our site. So they govern us because we get permits from DNR, and we can't put animals anywhere where the DNR doesn't inspect our caging and make sure that it's standard and our care, or our standards of care are up to speed. We already do a lot of work, by the way, with the Department of Health, and they don't really inspect, but we work with them even in our current building to make sure that well, one, we want to make sure that our volunteers are safe, and so with all the PPE, the protection stuff that people are suggested to wear. We're also, by the way, doing a tick study with them. We collect ticks off the animals we get, and the department, we give those to the Department of Health, and they get a good sampling then of the different kinds of ticks that are around, and testing for Lyme disease. Let's see, I think that's that covers the stuff, I think. Oh, and the pond view, one of the reasons I walked the property with Ricky before we bought it, and one of the things, and if you look on that, the only thing that is even remotely in your view now is that existing horse, there's a little lean-to shed there. And there's nothing to the east of that at all. So, yeah, and really, this is my best guess now what we're going to look like in 10 years. So that's 5 to 10 years. So that's the unknown. That's right. Yeah. But we decided that with working with the city, we decided, as Jill said, not to just piecemeal it, that just look ahead as far as we could, and so nobody gets surprised, so that's what we did.
All right.
So,
did your questions get answered? Got them all.
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, Kim.
Jerry has a question for Jennifer.
I have other questions and comments. I guess a lot of people have mentioned traffic. I'd like to point out just one statistic, and it doesn't answer everybody's questions, but looking at the traffic count on that road, on that section of road, it's like 1,950 cars a day. So if we talk about 25 cars coming and going, adds 50 to it, that's about a 2.5% effect on the current traffic. So at least if you're looking at highway traffic just by itself, it's not a big bulge. Question on, a quick one on the squirrels. I assume that's a totally enclosed cage. Squirrels wouldn't be able to escape into the neighborhood?
No, that's the other one I forgot to mention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you come up to the mic, please?
Everything is double caged, and I don't know that we've had in 17 years at Roseville more than a half a dozen animals that ever self-released, and most of those were birds. So yeah, they're usually kept in 4 by 8 by 7 foot smaller, and we'll put 6 or 8 squirrels in each one of those, and then they're put in a room, say, that's that's fenced this size, and then these individual cages are in there. Because they are impossible to catch. And when they're ready to release, you don't want to be chasing them around a room this large. You want them to be in a smaller cage, so.
Hold on. Okay, how do we stand on some of the requests for additional conditions?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I've been through the narrative, and there's essentially three, from what I can tell, three additional conditions that we're really talking about with respect to cleaning the caged areas, the daily cleaning. There is, we could add an additional condition with respect to securing and maintaining the caging, being a little bit more direct about that. Adding a condition with respect to there will be no on-site releases on the property. Adding a condition about the animal carcasses and not being disposed of. So just double checking. I think those are the ones that were not covered in the existing list of conditions. I think everything else is generally covered unless there's another one you have caught.
Well, I guess one of my questions, there's a couple additional things. One of my questions, I guess, was just procedure, whether this is the time to go through all this. But in reading through the ordinance, and there's an ordinance on animals and wild animals, and it defines wild animals that are not permitted. It's section 6-20 definitions, and then 621 is the conditional use permit. There's a particular sentence at the end of that section that basically all these wild animals, keeping them, some of them are dangerous domestic animals, whatever, they're not permitted. But the exception is it may be issued a permanent conditional use permit provided applicable zoning requirements are met, and that's for a bona fide research institution or veterinary hospital. So I think if we're considering this a veterinary hospital, or using that more restrictive use compared to a wildlife preserve or wildlife reserve, then, you know, that language, I think applies, but my concern is if the city grants this conditional use permit, in my mind, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, that allows them to keep anything on this list potentially, even though they may not be permitted for it now. And, you know, I don't know that a condition we may want to include is that we don't ever allow them to keep exotic or invasive species there. Or, you know, whether, or wild animals from other continents, you know, just things like that. I think something we need to think about if this gets approved in 10 years and they have a different board, the conditions, like Jennifer said, go with the land. They're, whatever is set at the beginning are the conditions that are gonna run with the land. And someone in the future could have a different vision for this property. And we need to be specific on the conditions in a situation like this, I think, to make sure that if it's allowed, they're only allowed to do what we envision them to do.
I read this ordinance to apply to this situation, that they are restricted by everything that's in 620 here.
Yeah, except if you read 621, that gives them the way I read it, that gives them an exemption, and I don't know if that's your place to comment on that ordinance, or if that's legal, but that's the way I read it. But the last sentence in 621 is where a conditional use permit can be
Wasn't that, was
allowed.
that for dogs or no?
No, it's in the wild animal section, 6-21.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I think it's perfectly acceptable to add two conditions that no exotic or invasive species may ever be kept on site. I think that's an easy one to add, and there's no harm in being very specific. And then also a condition with respect to basically no non-native to the area species.
I don't want to make it so difficult for you and the building inspector to control this, right? That it's something that you can actually measure, but some of these things are important.
Well,
and-
I am a wildlife
Yeah,
expert,
and
so.
I don't necessarily want to make it so, you know, go through this ad infinitum, because I'm sure the council, if this gets to the council, will have their own opinions on what needs to be changed and added.
So we would add essentially those two, plus we would add the cleaning the cages. We would add the statement about security with the caging and the waste removal, animal carcasses, and on-site release.
I think so.
Those are, I think,
It's a
fairly
lot,
easy.
but this is an unusual use.
There's a little context to the invasive species, non-native species. That's a really, it's a big deal to the animal population people. What we say is we take all animals that have, all migratory birds or animals that have a breeding season in Minnesota. There are people who don't think house sparrows, they think they're an invasive species. They've been here since 1850, but they're considered by some. So we're happy if you say it invasive species, and then there are certain species that are considered by the state invasive. But what we tell our public is we only take animals that have established breeding populations. So not pythons or any of that kind of stuff, so.
Jennifer, do we have the excrement removal subject covered?
Yes.
We're good there?
Well, they're removing, I mean, their narrative, if we basically document the narrative, it's a very specific process, and as long as that makes its way in the conditional use permit.
Okay.
So,
We're done
which is
there.
what we were just talking about.
Are we far enough along in this to vote tonight? Or do you want to take a month off and get some more information, or are you ready?
Could I ask whether or not you'd look for a condition about some market study? I mean, I think that came up from several, that there's some kind of analysis done to demonstrate whether or not it will negatively impact or could potentially adversely impact property values.
So would you like to keep this open until next month?
No, I'm asking whether we should put a condition in requiring them to
Okay, I
provide
see.
it to demonstrate.
To demonstrate that it does not negatively impact.
Right. I mean, here's the caveat to that. I've seen a lot of these studies, if you will, that have been done, and it's generally, there's no magic bullet that's going to tell you for certain that it's absolutely not going to. But they can find studies or information out there, or hire an independent consultant to look at it and look at similarly situated properties and what they've done to property values and whether or not there's been a significant impact. So it's not saying that there won't be any impact, but it will at least highlight whether or not there's been observable trends of similar uses and things happening adjacent. So I've looked at many of them before. They're not an exact science, but they are certainly information that helps us understand whether or not there's the potential of a significant impact. So the question is whether you would want that as a condition. The applicant would be responsible for doing it and submitting it.
Yeah, I get, or we could table it and have them bring the information back, but I don't know if we think we have enough, and that's the only thing.
I don't know, I think to bring it back would be rehashing an awful lot for no good reason. I think by making it a condition instead, I think it covers that base, and I think we should
Everybody ready to vote?
act, you know.
You are?
Well, we need a motion, I think.
Just a quick polling here.
Let's see what the
Okay.
motion is.
I'd like to hear a motion on sending this to the city council with a recommendation in favor of the applicant.
I'd like to make the motion.
If you
that
would include the various conditions that we've put in, that would be part of the motion. So,
Making the motion?
I know, I'm just
Well,
entertaining, do you want to make that motion now?
okay, I'll make a motion that we forward it to the city looking favorably upon it with the added conditions that have been brought up. Is that clear enough?
I'll second that motion.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 3, Did you vote?
No, I'm waiting. All those,
Oh,
Nay?
all those in favor say aye.
That's three.
Okay,
There's three of us.
all the nays?
nay.
Hey,
2 to 3.
So for those, because I know we're gonna walk out quick, this will be on the next city council agenda. So if you're interested in hearing what the city council discussion is, it'll be in February.
Okay. We have,
Up to the chair.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
yes,
I just want to defend my honor. Dennis said that I came from politics. I've never been a politician. I worked for an organization called the Citizens League, which is a community-based, nonpartisan research organization. So, just so that, I wanted to clear the air on that to get it in.
join you there. We've been appointed, so we're not.
no, you just gotta
This isn't
understand, we don't
political
want
for
them
us.
out here. That's all, none of the neighbors want them. They're gonna do whatever.
Okay, next,
Real quickly, so is there gonna be another meeting on this?
No.
City council
city
meeting.
council meeting, next meeting.
City council, because it passed 3-2 to go ahead.
Kim, when is the next city council meeting?
Yeah.
February 4th at?
February 4th.
Yeah.
And-
I will just note that it will not include a public hearing.
Yeah, you can't speak. This was it.
But the council decides.
Yeah. So if you want to talk to the council members, fine, call them, they've got their number and that, and explain to them. I don't
I hope
agree.
if I make another, meeting like this, that you guys are a little more organized. Okay, really listen to what's going on. All right, that's all I got to say.
Thank you. Okay, the next order of business is public hearing consideration for minor subdivision at the corner of 110th Street and Kelvin Avenue. Jennifer, what do you have for us on this one?
All right, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, before us this evening, we have a request for a minor subdivision. I would anticipate that the next two agenda items might go a little faster, maybe. We'll see.
Yes. Well, I think we've thinned out the audience.
Last item, so we hope so.
I think we will pick up the pace. Okay. So the proposed project this evening, the applicant is Joseph Ingebrand Real Estate LLC. I'm guessing that the representative is here. I have not met him, so, but I'm assuming, yep, there's a wave. Okay, he's here, great. The owner is Ryko Investments. The property is currently unaddressed because there is no home on it, so it is a vacant parcel. It is generally on the northwest corner, the northwest intersection of 110th and Kelvin. The land use and zoning of the property is A1. The proposed minor subdivision will create two lots, a 10.23 acre lot and a 10.0 acre lot, so both roughly 10 acres. There was a duly noticed public hearing for the meeting this evening. Existing conditions, the parcel is irregularly shaped, but fairly consistent in terms of it's obviously oriented north-south. You can see that it's heavily vegetated. There are some wetlands in there, which we will talk about in just a few moments. And the proposed configuration of where those homes are is kind of nestled up in the wetlands and in the trees. So fairly nice lots from what we're looking at. So the proposed subdivision is essentially a split right down the middle. Parcel A is the slightly larger parcel. While it's not totally visible up here, because we always have a little bit of a challenge, the wetland areas are highlighted, so you can kind of see they go through sort of the center of both parcels. And you can see that the proposed building pad kind of nestles up near or adjacent to those wetland areas. We're going to talk about the wetland setbacks in just a few moments, but because of where they're located, Staff has included a couple additional conditions with respect to those setbacks, because obviously from a structural perspective, we have both a setback from the wetland or the delineated edge, but also then a no-touch buffer of 10 feet in addition to that. So in terms of our zoning and dimensional standards, both lots meet our minimum lot area. They meet our minimum frontage, which you can see on the lot tabulation, which is a table that is on bottom. There is approximately 510 feet of frontage on parcel A. Some of my changes did not get saved, so lot 5, which is actually parcel B, has 330 feet of frontage, and both of them meet our criteria. Again, we've got those wetlands that are on the parcel, so as a result of that, we've got the additional setbacks that get tripped in. There's no existing structures on either parcel, so they're vacant today. There is a wetland delineation that was completed for the parcel. It was done late in the growing season last year, and as a result, it actually did not go through the formal review process with the watershed district in the city. So the TEP panel, as they call it, has not convened and taken a look at it to my knowledge. So based on that, we don't have a notice of decision on the wetland delineation, but we have a fairly good idea of where those wetland boundaries are. Since the wetland delineation is not approved, we actually are, because of where those building pad locations are proposed, they will have to complete that delineation in the spring. So essentially what happens is the TEP panel will convene, the watershed district, which the city is also a part of, takes a look at it and says, yeah, we believe those are the boundaries. They confirm that, then they get established, then that's where the setback is measured from. So if you look at the site plan right now, the building pad location is set back approximately 51 feet from the edge, I believe, and so our setback is 50 feet. So depending on if that edge shifts in any way, the building pad location might have to shift as a result of it. So staff would note that we need to have a condition in our approval that basically says you need to adjust and make sure you're meeting those setbacks at time of a building permit being pulled. With respect,
I'll ask later.
okay. With respect to new accessory buildings, there are none on the site. They will be required to follow the city's ordinance with respect to accessory buildings. So parcels between 9.6 and 14.99 acres are limited to no more than 4 buildings and 3,500 square feet. So both parcels will have that restriction since they're both over 10 acres. They did have a proposed driveway location on the site plan. Both of them meet our setback requirements. Septic systems it's a similar consideration to the building pad location. If the wetland delineation were to be shifted or that boundary moves, which sometimes happen, especially after a winter, and depending on how much snow we get, they might end up getting bigger or smaller, or whatever it is, that those septic systems need to be outside of all applicable setbacks as well. So if that requires shifting, then that will need to happen as well. And that needs to happen before a building permit is issued by the city. The draft conditions, as staff has drafted them, are in your staff report this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
You want to ask her a question?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is relating to the additional buffer from the setback from the wetland. So these building pads, in essence, need to be 60 feet from the wetland delineation once that's determined?
Correct, but of course, because these are conceptual building pad locations, it could jog in 10 feet there, or there might be so.
Because of the shape of the structure, that sort of thing.
Exactly,
Okay, got it.
exactly.
And then my second question was, and maybe you covered this while you were talking, but in here it says something about the driveway for parcel A is 20 feet from a wetland. I think that was parcel B. Is that what we were talking about when you're partway up?
Yes.
Like halfway up? Okay. But again, that would have to be reconfigured once the wetland delineation is.
Once we verify. And so depending on what actually the delineation reveals, we do have exceptions for allowing access and driveways through buffer areas as a result. So if it can't be avoided, there are ways to, because we have to permit access, so.
They're just, wetlands are kind of across the front of that parcel, so it wouldn't
Exactly.
necessarily make that parcel inaccessible.
Anybody else have questions? Jennifer? Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer. Does the property representative want to speak?
Planning Commission members, chair, staff. Ben Schmidt with the Excelsior Group. Joe's a client of ours. We've kind of helped him through the process. All I came up to say was, we have nothing to say. Well, in the interest of time, we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. We think it's pretty straightforward. Appreciate your time and consideration.
Thank you for the consideration. Anybody want to ask questions? No questions, we can move on from there. I'd like to hear a motion to open for public hearing.
So move. Second.
All right, here we go. Does anybody have any comments on this proposal? Hearing none, we will close the public hearing with a motion.
Move that we close the public hearing.
Second the motion.
Got a
Gotta vote on it,
motion
too.
and a second, and
Did you vote on
I'd
it?
like
too?
to, yeah. By saying aye,
We need a motion.
yeah, we need a motion, okay. Make a motion, or somebody make a motion to close public hearing.
Make a motion to accept subdivision of this land, the minor subdivision.
All right, and a second from,
Second.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Nope.
Assume that's
All
what
right,
the-
that one's taken care of.
Just a point of clarification, I assume that's what the conditions that Jennifer had.
You with the conditions Jennifer had, she said they're part of her thing here. So, all right, we have one more.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. It's obvious we should have taken these in the reverse order.
Yeah, I know.
Lesson learned for next time, right?
Yeah, there you go. Okay, the next item that we're going to consider tonight is consideration of a minor subdivision, 9215 Ideal Avenue. Jennifer, what do you have for us on this one?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we have a minor subdivision request at 9215 Ideal Avenue North. Again, hopefully this will go fairly quickly as well. The applicant this evening is Ray Gunderson. He is here on behalf of the owner, which is a trust. The property is located at 9215 Ideal Avenue North. The land use and zoning is guided A2. The proposed minor subdivision will create a vacant lot which is just about 10 and a half acres or 10.46 acres. And the remaining parcel, for some reason, I think it's 69, and I might have a typo here, so we're gonna check that in a second. It says, it's either 79 or 69.94, but I believe it's 69. And there's a duly noticed public hearing for this evening. The existing conditions are this, which is pretty clean, not a whole lot going on. You'll see that the road does kind of meander through the existing wetland complex on the northern edge of the property. So obviously from an access perspective, that plays a role when we take a look at it. Otherwise, it's pretty sparsely vegetated, and there's not a lot with respect to limitations of where you could have a potential building location except for those existing wetlands. So here's the proposed subdivision. We'll talk about the configuration of the lot in just a moment. This applicant, like the last, did actually go through a wetland delineation on the property, but again, they did it late in the year. So they are in the same situation as the previous applicant, which is that the notice of decision has not been issued on the property. So those wetland boundaries are essentially delineated, but they're not confirmed by the TUP panel and by the watershed district, et cetera, until next spring. They, like the last applicant, are proposing to kind of nestle the home up to the wetland area once again. And so as a result, the building pad location and the septic system location actually encroach into the setback area or have the potential to, and therefore might have to be shifted. So we can talk about that more in a few moments. But The proposal, which you can see up here where the shaded area is on the survey, is really what the surveyor has identified as sort of the buildable area. So that's the area that's outside of the delineated wetland, and where the steep slopes don't exist, et cetera. So based on that, he also, you can see around the perimeter, if you're looking at your hard copies, if you look at the perimeter, he's got the setback, the rear yard setback, the side yard setbacks, et cetera. The proposed parcel A is irregular in shape, which you can see here. So I touched on that in the staff report, and I'll touch on it in a few moments as well. But essentially, it's carving out sort of this interior lot, parcel A, and leaving the remaining parcel B surrounding it with a fairly large contiguous acreage. So parcel B includes the existing house today and the existing accessory buildings, and you can see where the existing driveway actually connects to those locations as well. From a dimensional and a zoning perspective, the resulting lot does meet all of our zoning requirements and dimensional standards. It has the minimum of 5 acres, et cetera. It meets our frontage requirements. So from that perspective, it's meeting all of our criteria when we take a look at it, except for the wetland setbacks, once again, become an issue in terms of where the actual building pad location gets cited. Just for everybody's reference, it's not that unusual that we would have these conceptual building pad locations. The bigger challenge is actually related to the septic system location, because the septic system location is where they've already poked holes. And so that's where we know it perks. We know that a septic system can be supported, but if it has to shift, then they have to go back out and poke new holes. So that relationship is the more critical. The building pad, based on how big the parcel is, we know you can find a building pad location that's not as challenging. The bigger challenge is the septic system. So on the existing homestead on parcel B, the setbacks are met. Everything checks out from that perspective. I talked about the wetland delineation. They're gonna have to go through that process again to confirm it and confirm those boundaries in the spring. Based on the current location, the septic site does not appear to meet the current setback requirements, and therefore that would have to be shifted as well. But again, if the wetland edge changes, then it might meet it. So it's a little bit tricky because we aren't going to know until next spring whether it does or it doesn't. Once again, we've got the same standards with respect to the accessory buildings and making sure that the applicant understands that the resulting parcel will be limited by that, as opposed to parcel B, which is a much larger parcel and has unlimited structures and square footage, et cetera. The driveways as they propose meet the setback requirements. The septic system is likely to have to shift depending on where that edge ends up being delineated from. We, as a planning commission, have looked at numerous times the fact that our setback standard is actually more restrictive than the county's setback standard. So the county, I believe it's a 50-foot setback, and ours is 75 feet. We've talked about, both at the city council level and the planning commission level, actually adjusting that so that our ordinance matches the county's ordinance with respect to setbacks. If that were to be the case, then the septic system location in its current configuration would meet the setbacks. So if that happens, which I think is likely to happen because the council has directed us to kind of take a look at that as one of the things, one of the ordinance pieces to update, by the time the application were to come through with a building permit, et cetera, we would verify that it meets the setbacks that are in place at the time that that application is made. The last piece, section 30-107, so chapter 30 is our subdivision ordinance. Whenever we have a minor subdivision, I go in and review the criteria of lot and block dimensions, et cetera. In a minor subdivision, as you all recall, oftentimes we waive the requirement that they have to plat the property. But we still take a look at the design standards in the platting process, because that's what gives us the guidance on how to configure or create lots. So as a result of that, there is a section in there, which we've talked about numerous times, about creating lots that have straight lines and not having irregular jogs, et cetera. So while the connection, and I'm going to go back if I can, Well, the connection to the roadway, so on the frontage meets at a 90-degree angle, obviously then we create this irregularly jogged lot line around the rear. So the question is whether or not that's acceptable or not, and whether you think that meets the intent of that section of the ordinance. Typically, we have actually asked for this type of configuration to be straightened out, unless there's a reason, unless there's a topographic reason, or there's some wetland or something that necessitates this type of configuration. So that's something we would need to ask the applicant, because I'm not sure, based on my high-level review of it, that there's anything significant that would preclude them from being able to straighten those lot lines, which we have done in the past. So lastly, I have a set of conditions that are proposed to you in the staff report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
The lines. That is a very odd shape for a lot.
Perhaps there's a great reason for it, so I know the applicant is here, and they can
Okay, we'll
talk
get
to
to
us
that.
about that.
Hasn't our concern usually been know how the lot lines hit the street? So you know just how much frontage is on the street as opposed to farther back from the street?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that is part of it. However, we have made applicants straighten it out interior. Part of that is because oftentimes when you have these irregularly shaped lots, people don't know where their lot lines are. And so it makes it much cleaner, of course, if you've got a clean 90-degree side lot line. So our ordinance states that at the frontage or at the right-of-way line that you need the 90-degree. And then also, if you're on a cul-de-sac, that you have to have a radial lot line. In configurations like this, though, we have asked that unless there's a reason, which I can think of one where we permitted it because there was an actual, like a wetland break or a stream or something that came through it that made it very clear that there was a geographic reason for it. It did get permitted, but we have also asked folks that in similar configurations to this to straighten it.
Anybody else have questions? Well, okay, I guess it's time to open up the
applicant.
Oh, applicant. Yeah, let's get the applicants in. I'm gonna jump ahead of myself again.
I'll sign in real quick, yeah.
Sign.
Yeah.
You won't be surprised if we ask you about lot lines, will you?
Yeah, absolutely not, yeah. Good evening, my name is Jason Rude. I'm with E.G. Rude and Sons, and we're working with the Gunderson family here on this subdivision. I think I just speak to a few of the questions, just go right to that. I commend you guys on your staying power here this evening. It's been a bit of a marathon, and so I'll just kind of walk through the conditions. One of the items talks about the site plan for parcel A should be revised to show the building pad location outside of all applicable setbacks, including the wetland setback area. Jennifer was spot on. You know, we did a smattering of borings throughout the upland area to show that we had good ground to work with and the borings were favorable. The Gundersons will design a home following approval that will meet the setback requirements. The wetlands, she's accurate. They were delineated, but the notice of decision won't come out till the spring. Slight variations that are happen or requested by the watershed are, I believe, going to be able to be accommodated. I did have, I guess, a couple questions I just wanted to ask specific to the setbacks. In the planner's report, it talks about a setback to a county road being, I believe it was spelled out to center line of 150 feet. And I wanted to confirm, is Ideal a county road?
It is not. So if that is in there, that is,
Because I think the standard setback would be 60 feet.
it's 65.
Or 65 feet on the front setback. Yeah.
I think it's incorrect in the table. It's incorrect in the table, but it's not incorrect in the analysis. So the table just didn't get updated on page 2.
Okay,
So it's accurate in page 3. The front yard setback is accurate and meets our criteria, which is stated in the analysis.
Okay.
The table just didn't get updated.
so what is the front setback?
65 feet.
65 feet, okay, I just wanted to be clear on that. And then, I guess my other question was pertaining to setbacks for septic systems. How are they interpreted in a front yard setback? The septic systems?
How are they interpreted in the front yard setback?
Yeah,
So typically, they need to be out of all yard setbacks.
yard setbacks? Okay, okay. Very good. So it'll be noted that, or it'll be clear that the front yard setback is 65 feet. Perfect. Pertaining to the lot lines, that seems to be the question at hand. Does this project up onto the monitor?
We can change it, or I can pop it up. I have it up there as well, if that's.
Actually, I've got a separate exhibit if we
Oh.
can change it, yeah.
I just have to look at it. before I
Sure.
can- There you go.
Okay, thank you. So the Gundersons have owned the property for 90 years and then homesteaded here for over 70 years. The immediate goal is for Ray to be able to build a home. Really, this was for their own internal use for maybe 20 years down the road. This is not their intention, but they want to be able to plan for the future. And so our goal in these side lot lines, I guess to be direct and answer the question is, and I'd be happy to visit with the planner afterwards and ensure what we have. But I've kind of done a layout of what would accommodate if they did subdivide in the future. And so that's the reason why we have an angled lot line. This would be our 10-acre parcel, just kind of right on it right here.
Yep.
And then this would be owned by Ray and his family. But if his entire family, I think there's 5 siblings, can come to an agreement to subdivide in the future, then they have that flexibility. So that's the purpose behind it. Does that answer the question?
Close. You need to have
What the access
the yellow curve coming down. That's not a road there now. That's for future.
No, this is a layout, this is a sketch plan, which really was for their own family's purpose, to plan for the future.
Okay, so further down south is where the house is that you're talking about now. Or
What he shaded in.
Right here is where Ray hopes to build this spring,
all right.
okay? These are the lot lines for Ray's property that he's gonna split off. This, in the future, could be a cul-de-sac to serve the rest of the property.
Okay.
I'm sure Ray could speak to maybe the future and the likelihood of that if there's more questions. I didn't want to confuse the issue here. This is not a sketch plan review.
May I suggest we stick with what
You got it.
Yeah,
the application is
yeah,
for, and not discuss the future phase?
yeah,
You
but
okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I just tried to.
If they have
get-
questions, they
get to
can work
that
with
lot
Jennifer
lines.
yeah.
on that in the future.
And again, if the planner would like to review our sketch plan just kind of at a high level, I'd be happy to do that. But that's the reason for the side lot lines like they are.
So they have a reason. I guess is
Yep.
the point.
Yeah, you do have a reason, but
Yep.
I'm not sure that delivers the goods that you're looking for. All right.
Any questions to the applicant?
Anybody else have any questions?
No?
All right,
All right, thank you.
you bet.
Thank you. Open up.
Well, where do we stand with our,
Open the public hearing.
we'll get to that in a minute. but
Open public hearing.
With the outlines, you know what our standards are, we know what the county wants. Is there wiggle room in this to straighten some of that out?
So, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that's something you'll have to discuss, whether or not you want to allow some flexibility, knowing that there's a future, there's a reason why, however, it's a reason that's not before you today. So the question is whether or not you're comfortable with saying, well, we understand what the reason is in the future, and therefore we're okay with it, and we're willing to consider some flexibility. There's no hard and fast, you have to do it. But you'll have to discuss that as a planning commission, what your comfort level is and what you'd like to do. I can't tell you what to do.
I guess my concern, and I think we should require the lot lines to be straightened out, because that's the proposal that's before us. If we consider something that may happen in the future, one, it may not happen. Two, we don't know that thing that they want to potentially do in the future is something the council would ever approve. There's a lot more, when a major subdivision comes through, there's a lot more consideration that would go into this. And I think that lot lines could be adjusted again at that point in time if they need be. That's my thoughts on it.
So you're in favor
that we
of-
should, and as other people have come before us and come before the city have had to do, is have them conform to our standards unless there's a hardship of the land or some clear reason in the land that prevents them from doing it. Like there's why abandon an acre that they can't get to across a swamp or a stream or something as part of their parcel? And I know that's come up before, from my brief time on the council before, I think it came up twice. So I think that's my opinion, that's the way I think we should look at this.
Too, I've been exposed to have been a lot smaller tracts where possibility of a major subdivision later really wasn't in the picture. You know, we were talking about a 20-acre lot or something, and somebody dividing in a funny angle.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that, we don't have enough information to know whether that potentiality would ever be approved or come to pass, so.
Not really our
it's-
business at this
Yeah,
point.
exactly, so I think we have to look at what's in front of us.
And you are in favor of straightening lines out a bit, if not all.
Yeah, I think we should
Okay,
follow
buddy.
I make a motion
the
to
lot
open
guidelines.
Public hearing.
Okay, let's do it. Please give me a motion for a public hearing.
Yeah.
He just did.
All
I'll
right.
second.
He seconds it, so we have a motion and a second on the floor. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? No. Okay, here we go.
They're doing it right now.
Pardon me? Yeah, public hearing just opened.
My name is Fred Diener, and we live just across off of Ivy Avenue. So I just wanted to compliment the commission on the thoughtfulness of this. It's my first one to the planning commission, and while during the discussion of wild animals was interesting, I was most interested in what my neighbors were doing. And I just want to say that these are great neighbors. And I think you should entertain, I understand the technical thing of what's in front of you, but I'm very supportive of the thoughtfulness of the family plan and what they're trying to accomplish as a neighbor. So, I would be supportive of kind of going with the irregular lines because it makes sense in terms of the long term and what they're trying to do. And keeping it it sounds like it's going to be a family type development as well, which is part of the neighborly, kind of family orientation of, if it's not going to be a farm forever, maybe it's going to support a family major subdivision, so anyhow, just wanted to compliment the process. I thought it was very good. I was glad to get the notice. I've never come to one of these before, gotten one of those things in the mail, but the discussion was extremely thoughtful, and I appreciate this relative to this project, but
All right. Did you get your autograph on there?
yeah, you did.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you need my phone number too, or no? What's the full address? Got it. So thank you very much.
Brett, we have an opening for a member on
He sits in a lot of good meetings.
Yeah, exactly. I said, this was good.
Mr. Chair and Planning Commissioners, I did get an email from a neighbor that asked to be part of the public record but couldn't attend the meeting tonight. It was from a Maori Stilp at 8840 Indall Avenue. And they just indicated they had absolutely no problem with or issues with the Gunderson subdivision.
Okay.
I also received another call from a resident of Delwood. Did not catch her address, but also had no issues.
All right, that's right across the street, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay,
Those, anymore?
Yeah.
are you ready?
My only comment is that I would tend to agree with you that there's been a lack of a hardship proved or established here, and I would like to stay consistent with what we promote with the property lines, and they can be redrawn in the future. Jennifer's draft conditions do ask to reconfigure the lot lines, and I would vote that we keep it with the same language that she had written in the draft conditions.
Hearing is still open, I believe.
Yes, it is still open yet, yeah. Is there any other comments from anybody? Get a motion to close public hearing.
I'll make them.
Okay, I so move.
Second? All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? No.
I
All
make
right.
a motion that we move this favorably to the city council as proposed with the lot lines, irregular lot lines.
And any things Jennifer has?
And otherwise with the conditions that Jennifer has laid out.
I don't quite understand the motion. You want to stick with the lot lines they have, or
Yes.
with Jennifer's condition?
Jennifer's conditions except for the lot lines.
So strike out
I
number
wanna go
3.
with the regular,
So you
yeah.
want to strike out number 3 on our draft
I guess
conditions?
that would be correct.
Okay.
yeah. It's a
Like that,
family
Jennifer?
sort of thing.
Family.
He's making a motion to scratch off number 3 of your conditions and accept the lot lines. You got it, okay. Any other comments? All right, let's take a motion to, or he just did it. You gave a
seconded
motion, did you get a second yet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
I'm sorry, who did the second? Jerry?
No,
No, I made the motion.
he made the motion and.
and Matt did
Matt
the
seconded.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nays?
Nate?
Nay.
2 nays. Okay, I think that's kind of wraps things up.
Not if we don't want to adjourn.
That's just, they're concerned about the lot lines and the.
Is there any old business anybody wants to bring up?
Nope.
No.
Would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn the planning commission meeting.
I'll second that. All those in favor? Aye. Shirley? Any nays? No, there aren't any.
Hi.